August 17th, 1943, Duxford Airfield, England. Master Sergeant Paul Lipscomb knelt beside the fuel truck, carefully measuring ratios that no technical manual authorized. Into the standard 100-grade aviation gasoline, he added precise quantities of tryptane and isooctane, creating a mixture that would make Republic Aviation's engineers recoil. The concoction flowing into the P-47C Thunderbolts fuel tanks bore a performance number approaching 140 on the rich mixture scale, 30 points higher than anything the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine had been designed to handle. Lieutenant Robert Johnson would fly this aircraft in 4 hours on an escort mission to Schweinfurt. Neither Johnson nor his squadron commander knew that the fuel feeding his engine had been chemically altered by a mechanic who believed standard procedures were killing American pilots. What Lipscomb understood, and what the Army Air Forces would not officially acknowledge for another 8 months, was that the massive radial engine bolted to the front of every Thunderbolt was being choked by fuel that could not sustain the compression ratios the engine was physically capable of achieving. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp displaced 2,800 cubic inches across 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. It weighed over 2,000 pounds and generated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff power. Yet, in combat above 20,000 feet, where thin air reduced both engine performance and wing efficiency, the 8-ton Thunderbolt climbed like a freight elevator, while German Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s pulled away vertically with apparent ease. German pilots had learned this lesson through repeated combat encounters during summer of 1943. Attack American bomber formations, fire quick bursts at the 4 engine targets, then pull into steep climbs. The heavy American escort fighters simply could not follow. By the time Thunderbolts labored up to the altitudes where German fighters had escaped, the Luftwaffe had reformed and could attack again. This tactical pattern was bleeding the 8th Air Force dry. On August 17th alone, bombers attacking the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt would suffer losses of 36 aircraft destroyed and another 122 damaged. The problem was not courage. American pilots pressed attacks with aggression that sometimes bordered on recklessness. The problem was not numbers. By August 1943, more than 300 Thunderbolts were operating from English airfields. The problem was physics expressed through chemistry, and Master Sergeant Lipscomb believed he had found the solution in violations of Army Air Force's technical orders. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lipscomb had not arrived at his unauthorized fuel mixture through formal education. He possessed no degree in petroleum chemistry. His understanding came from 3 years working in his father's fuel distribution business in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he had learned that octane ratings measured detonation resistance and that skilled blending could create fuels with performance characteristics exceeding their components. When the Army drafted him in 1942, Lipscomb's civilian experience placed him in aviation fuel services. By May 1943, he was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group at Duxford, responsible for fuel quality control and distribution. What he witnessed in that role convinced him that standard operating procedures were inadequate for the air war being fought over Germany. The technical problem was detonation. When a piston engine compresses the air-fuel mixture during the compression stroke, temperature and pressure increase dramatically. If compression exceeds the fuel's detonation resistance, spontaneous ignition occurs before the spark plug fires. This creates shock waves that can destroy pistons, cylinder heads, and connecting rods within seconds. To prevent detonation, engine designers established maximum manifold pressure limits based on the fuel's octane rating. 100-grade fuel, standard for American fighters in early 1943, could sustain manifold pressures of approximately 52 inches of mercury before detonation became likely. The R2800 engine supercharger could theoretically generate manifold pressures exceeding 60 inches, but technical orders prohibited pilots from exceeding 52 inches except during emergency war power settings, lasting no more than 5 minutes. This restriction meant the R2800 operated at approximately 75% of its mechanical capability whenever engaged in combat. The engine had power reserves that fuel chemistry would not allow it to access. German engines faced similar restrictions, but with one critical difference. By mid-1943, priority Luftwaffe fighter units were receiving C3 fuel, a synthetic gasoline produced from German coal deposits using the Bergius process, C3. Fuel had a performance number approaching 130 on the rich mixture scale, significantly higher than standard American 100-grade fuel. This allowed German pilots to run higher manifold pressures without risking detonation, extracting more power from engines that were often smaller and lighter than American power plants. A Focke-Wulf 190A, equipped with the BMW 801 radial engine, displaced 1,730 cubic inches, substantially less than the R2000, 800's 2,800 cubic inches. Yet the German fighter could climb at rates matching or exceeding the heavier American aircraft because German fuel allowed the BMW engine to operate closer to its mechanical limits. Lipscomb understood this disparity because he read intelligence, reports that crossed his desk. These reports, compiled from interrogations of captured German pilots and analysis of recovered enemy aircraft, documented German fuel specifications. What frustrated Lipscomb was that American petroleum industry had already developed fuels superior to German C3. 130-grade fuel was in production at refineries in Texas and California. Higher performance fuels designated as 140 and 150 grade were undergoing testing, but bureaucratic inertia and logistical constraints meant these fuels would not reach England in operationally significant quantities until late 1943 or early 1944. Pilots were dying while improved fuel sat in storage tanks in Houston. The fuel chemistry that Lipscomb understood involved the properties of specific hydrocarbons. Standard 100-grade aviation gasoline consisted primarily of isooctane and normal heptane in ratios that defined the octane scale itself. Pure isooctane represented 100 octane. Pure normal heptane represented 0 octane. Blending these compounds in different ratios created fuels with octane ratings between 0 and 100. To exceed 100 octane required adding compounds with superior anti-knock properties. Tryptane, a branched-chain hydrocarbon with the chemical formula C7H16, possessed anti-knock characteristics superior to isooctane. Adding small quantities of tryptane to 100-grade fuel could push the performance number above 100. Similarly, increasing concentrations of aromatic hydrocarbons like benzene or toluene enhanced detonation resistance. The challenge was that these additives were expensive, difficult to produce in quantity, and required careful blending to achieve stable mixtures that would not separate or degrade during storage and handling. What Lipscomb possessed that petroleum engineers lacked was immediate access to small quantities of these compounds. The base fuel depot at Duxford received occasional shipments of specialty aviation fluids, including high-purity tryptane used for calibrating fuel testing equipment. Aromatic compounds arrived as components of paint thinners and solvents. Lipscomb began quietly acquiring these materials through requisitions that raised no suspicions. His first experiments occurred in May 1943, using a commandeered 50-gallon drum and measuring equipment borrowed from the base laboratory. He blended 5 gallons of standard 100-grade fuel with carefully measured quantities of tryptane, attempting to replicate the formulations he had read about in pre-war petroleum industry journals. Testing these mixtures required access to an engine, and access to engines required cooperation from mechanics who would not report his activities. Lipscomb found his collaborator in Technical Sergeant Raymond Walsh, a power plant mechanic who shared Lipscomb's frustration with bureaucratic restrictions. Walsh had been a civilian aircraft mechanic before the war, working on racing aircraft that routinely used experimental fuel mixtures to extract maximum performance. Walsh understood engine tuning and could detect detonation through sound and vibration signatures that instruments might miss. Together, Lipscomb and Walsh conducted tests during evening hours when flight operations had ceased. They would run an R-2800 engine on a test stand, gradually increasing manifold pressure, while Wulfs monitored for any indication of detonation. Standard 100-grade fuel would begin showing detonation signatures at 53 to 54 inches of mercury. Lipscomb's experimental blend sustained 60 inches before Wulfs detected the characteristic metallic pinging that indicated pre-ignition. This represented a breakthrough, but also created an ethical dilemma. The mixture worked, but using it violated technical orders. If Lipscomb's blend caused engine failure resulting in pilot death, he would face court-martial. Yet, if he did nothing, pilots would continue dying because their aircraft could not climb fast enough to engage German fighters effectively. The decision crystallized on August 13, 1943. The 56th Fighter Group lost 3 pilots during an escort mission to Gelsenkirchen. All 3 had been attacking German fighters at 24,000 feet when enemy aircraft pulled into steep climbs. The Thunderbolts attempted to follow but could not maintain pursuit. German fighters escaped to higher altitudes, reformed, then dove back onto the laboring American aircraft and shot them down. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, filed an after-action report that documented the tactical problem with unusual bluntness. German fighters possessed superior climbing performance above 20,000 feet. Until American fighters received engines or fuels that allowed matching German climb rates, escort missions would continue suffering unacceptable losses. Zemke's report, like dozens of similar reports from other fighter groups, would take weeks to filter through command channels before reaching decision-makers who might authorize fuel improvements. Lipscomb decided he could not wait for authorization that might never arrive. On the morning of August 17th, he prepared 400 gallons of his experimental blend, mixing it in the fuel truck under cover of pre-dawn darkness. This was enough to fully fuel 6 Thunderbolts. He waited until the regular fuel crew had departed, then personally fueled 6 specific aircraft that would fly as part of Lieutenant Robert Johnson's flight. He told no one what he had done. Not Wulfs, who would have tried to stop him. Not Johnson, who deserved to know but could not be expected to keep the secret. Not Zemke, who would have been forced to ground the aircraft and discipline Lipscomb. The burden of what might happen rested entirely on one. Master Sergeant, who believed his fuel mixture would work, but could not prove it without operational testing. The mission to Schweinfurt launched at 1000 hours. 230 B-17 flying fortresses assembled over England, formed into combat boxes, then set course for Germany. Escorting fighters included 190 Thunderbolts drawn from multiple fighter groups. The 56th Fighter Group would escort the bombers to the German border, approximately 300 miles, then break off as fuel state required return to England. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying Thunderbolt No. 236080, settled into position, protecting the bomber formation's right flank. His aircraft felt no different than usual during climb to altitude. Engine gauges showed normal readings. Control responses were standard. Nothing suggested that the fuel in his tanks differed from what every other Thunderbolt carried. German fighters appeared as the bomber formation crossed into German airspace near Eupen. Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader. One attacked from head-on, diving through the bomber formation, then pulling up sharply. Johnson's flight leader called the attack and rolled into pursuit. 6 Thunderbolts dove after the climbing German fighters. What happened next had never occurred in previous combat. The Thunderbolts followed the Focke-Wulfs through the climbing escape maneuver. Johnson pushed his throttle to the forward stop, bringing manifold pressure to 52 inches as technical orders specified. The engine responded with familiar acceleration. But as he pulled back on the stick to follow the climbing German fighter, his engine did not lose power or begin the characteristic roughness that indicated approaching detonation. Johnson instinctively pushed the throttle past the normal maximum position into the war emergency power range that regulations limited to 5-minute bursts. Manifold pressure climbed past 55 inches, past 58. At 60 inches, Johnson expected engine failure. Instead, the R-2800 pulled his 7-ton fighter up through 27,000 feet, still accelerating, still climbing, closing distance on the Focke-Wulf, whose pilot was now looking back in apparent disbelief at the pursuing American fighter that should not have been able to follow. At 29,000 feet, with both aircraft approaching stall speed in air so thin that control surfaces barely responded, Johnson's convergent 850 caliber machine guns fired a 3-second burst. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore into the Focke-Wulf's left-wing route. The German fighter rolled inverted and dropped away trailing smoke. Johnson recovered to level flight, checked his engine instruments, and found everything normal. Manifold pressure had returned to standard settings. Cylinder head temperatures were elevated but within limits. Oil pressure remained steady. His aircraft had just performed at power settings that should have destroyed the engine, yet suffered no apparent damage. The impossible had occurred, and Johnson did not understand why. 5 other pilots in his flight experienced similar encounters. Each had followed German fighters to altitudes exceeding 28,000 feet. Each had sustained manifold pressures above rated maximums without detonation. Each landed back at Duxford convinced something unusual had occurred but uncertain what. The pattern became clearer during debriefing. Colonel Zemke reviewed gun camera footage and pilot reports with growing interest. 6 pilots reported exceptional engine performance. 6 aircraft were discovered to have been fueled from the same truck. Zemke ordered those aircraft impounded and their fuel tanks sampled for analysis. By evening, base intelligence officers had traced the fuel to Master Sergeant Lipscomb. Lipscomb expected arrest. Instead, Zemke summoned him to group headquarters and asked a direct question. What was in that fuel, and could Lipscomb produce more? The technical violation would be addressed later. The immediate priority was understanding whether the performance improvement was real and repeatable. Lipscomb explained his blending process in detail. Zemke listened without interruption, then made a decision that would define both their careers. The experimental blend would undergo immediate controlled testing. If results confirmed operational improvements, Zemke would forward a formal recommendation through command channels, while simultaneously authorizing limited combat use under his authority as group commander. If the blend caused engine failures, Lipscomb would face court-martial, and Zemke would accept responsibility for authorizing unauthorized modifications. The technical risk was substantial, the political risk was career-ending, but the tactical advantage of fighters that could match German climbing performance was worth both risks. Testing began the following morning using 2 aircraft and 2 volunteer pilots who understood they were flying with experimental fuel that might cause catastrophic engine failure. Test pilot Captain Walter Cook took the first aircraft to 30,000 feet and methodically tested the engine at progressively higher power settings. At 60 inches of manifold pressure, the R2800 generated approximately 2,300 horsepower, nearly 15% more than rated maximum power. Climb rate at 25,000 feet improved from approximately 1,900 feet per minute to nearly 2,400 feet per minute. Maximum sustainable altitude, where climb rate dropped below 100 feet per minute, increased from 39,000 feet to nearly 42,000 feet. These were not incremental improvements. These represented transformation of the Thunderbolt, from adequate escort fighter to aircraft capable of matching German fighters in the vertical combat regime, where Germans had enjoyed decisive advantages. Cook's report confirmed what Johnson had experienced in combat. The experimental fuel allowed sustained operations at power settings that would cause immediate detonation with standard 100-grade fuel. The performance increases came with costs. Spark plug fouling occurred more rapidly due to increased lead deposits. Cylinder head temperatures ran higher, requiring careful monitoring during extended combat. Engine overhaul intervals would likely decrease, but these maintenance burdens were acceptable trade-offs for combat capability that could save pilots' lives. Zemke authorized expanded use while simultaneously sending detailed reports up the command chain. His message to 8th Air Force headquarters documented the unauthorized fuel testing, acknowledged the violations of technical orders, and requested both retroactive approval and immediate shipment of 130-grade fuel or better to England. The response came faster than expected. 8th Air Force. Commander Major General Frederick Anderson had been receiving similar reports from other fighter groups about German climbing performance advantages. Anderson understood tactical implications. He also understood that official channels would require months to evaluate and approve fuel changes. Anderson made a pragmatic command decision. He would not officially approve unauthorized fuel blending, but he would not order it stopped. Fighter group commanders who chose to experiment with fuel mixtures did so at their own risk and responsibility. Simultaneously, Anderson expedited shipment of 130-grade fuel from American refineries. The first tankers carrying the improved fuel departed Houston on August 25th, bound for England. This dual approach, unofficial tolerance of field modifications combined with official acceleration of proper solutions, characterized American military pragmatism at its best. By early September 1943, Lipscomb had refined his blending procedures and was producing experimental fuel in larger quantities. His mixture now included carefully calibrated additions of toluene and xylene, aromatic hydrocarbons that enhanced anti-knock properties while being more readily available than tryptane. The resulting fuel tested at approximately 135 performance number on the rich mixture scale, positioned between standard 100 grade and the 150 grade fuel that would arrive months later. Other fighter groups learned of the 56th's experiments through informal pilot networks. Requests for technical details reached Duxford from groups based at Bodney, Debden, and Halesworth. Zemke authorized sharing information, reasoning that improved performance across all Thunderbolt units would benefit the entire strategic bombing campaign. By mid-September, at least 4 fighter groups were producing and using experimental fuel blends. Chemical compositions varied based on available additives, but all achieved performance numbers between 120 and 140. The cumulative effect appeared in combat statistics. American fighter victory claims increased while loss rates declined. German tactical intelligence noted that American escort fighters were demonstrating improved performance, but could not identify the cause. Luftwaffe technical officers examining crashed or captured Thunderbolts found no modifications to engines, superchargers, or fuel systems that would explain performance improvements. The answer lay in liquid that left no evidence after burning. The crucial test came during missions to Stuttgart and Berlin in early September. Fighter groups using experimental fuels reported successful engagements at altitudes above 28,000 feet. German fighters attempting to escape through climbing maneuvers were consistently caught and destroyed. 8th Air Force intelligence calculated that fighter groups using improved fuels achieved victory to loss ratios approximately 30% better than groups flying on standard fuel. This was significant enough to affect strategic outcomes, but not overwhelming enough to immediately end German fighter resistance. On September 6, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Zemke led the 56th Fighter Group on an escort mission to Stuttgart. His entire group now flew on Lipscomb's experimental blend. During combat over the target, German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 27 attacked the bomber formation. Zemke's pilots engaged, and for the first time in the air war over Germany, Thunderbolts chased German fighters through extended vertical combat without losing position or energy state. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 14 German fighters destroyed without losing a single Thunderbolt to air combat. 1 aircraft was lost to flak. 13 pilots returned, describing combat where their aircraft performed as they had always wished but never previously experienced. Engine power seemed unlimited. Climb rates matched anything the Germans attempted. Tactical options that had been theoretical became practical. Zemke's after-action report, forwarded to 8th Air Force headquarters with unusual classification markings, documented both the fuel modifications and the combat results. He included Lipscomb's chemical analysis and Cook's flight test data. He acknowledged violating technical orders and requested formal approval to continue operations using experimental fuel until official 130-grade supplies arrived. Major General Anderson's response arrived by courier within 48 hours. Zemke was commended for initiative, Lipscomb would receive a commendation rather than court-martial. Experimental fuel use was authorized on an interim basis, with the understanding that all responsibility rested with field commanders who chose this path. Official 130-grade fuel would arrive in England during October, with priority distribution to fighter groups conducting deep penetration escort missions. The institutional response revealed how American military hierarchy functioned during the war. Regulations existed to prevent dangerous improvisation, but commanders who achieved results through calculated rule-breaking were rewarded rather than punished. This created an organizational culture that encouraged aggressive problem-solving while maintaining nominal adherence to proper procedures. The tension between regulation and innovation defined much of American military effectiveness. 130-grade fuel arrived at English ports aboard tankers during late October 1943. Distribution took additional weeks as the fuel moved through the logistics chain from port facilities to inland depots to airfield storage tanks. By November, most fighter groups had transitioned from experimental blends to official 130-grade fuel. Lipscomb's unauthorized work became unnecessary once proper supplies arrived. The performance difference between Lipscomb's blend and official 130-grade fuel was minimal. Both allowed sustained manifold pressures of approximately 60 inches. Both improved climb rates by 400 to 600 feet per minute at combat altitudes. Both extended maximum operational ceiling by approximately 3,000 feet. The primary advantage of official fuel was consistency. Every batch met identical specifications. Quality control testing occurred at refineries. Chemical analysis confirmed performance before shipment. Lipscomb's field blending, while effective, introduced variables that professional petroleum engineers would not accept. Batch-to-batch variations could affect performance. Contamination risks increased when mixing fuels in non-laboratory conditions. Long-term storage stability was uncertain. For these reasons, the transition to officially produced 130-grade fuel represented genuine improvement, even though performance characteristics were similar. The broader question was what 130-grade fuel meant for the air war. German fighters had enjoyed climbing performance advantages throughout 1943. This advantage disappeared during fourth quarter 1943 as American fighters transitioned to superior fuel. German pilots who had survived through summer by climbing away from American escorts discovered this escape route had closed. Tactical reports from Luftwaffe fighter units during late 1943 document confusion and frustration. American fighters that previously could not follow climbing attacks were now matching German performance. Intelligence officers initially suspected Americans had introduced new fighter types with improved engines. Only after examining captured aircraft did Germans realize the changes involved fuel rather than mechanical modifications. German aviation fuel production remained bottlenecked by reliance on synthetic processes. The Bergius process converted coal into liquid fuel through high-temperature, high-pressure hydrogenation. This worked, but required massive industrial facilities, enormous energy inputs, and rare catalyst materials. Germany operated 12 major synthetic fuel plants by 1943, producing approximately 6 million tons of fuel annually. This sounds impressive until compared to American petroleum industry output of 180 million tons annually from natural crude oil. The disparity was fundamental. America possessed vast natural oil reserves in Texas, California, and Oklahoma. American refineries converted crude oil to aviation gasoline using catalytic cracking, a process developed during the 1930s that was faster, more efficient, and more flexible than German synthesis. American fuel chemists could modify blending formulas quickly to produce higher octane fuels. German chemists working with synthetic fuel had far less flexibility. By December 1943, some Luftwaffe units were receiving improved C3 fuel with performance approaching 140 on the rich mixture scale, but production quantities remained limited. Priority allocation went to fighter units defending the Reich. Fighter groups on other fronts continued using B4 fuel rated at approximately 100 octane. Even elite units receiving premium C3 fuel could not match the fuel quality available to ordinary American fighter squadrons. This represents one of the war's quiet ironies. Germany's sophisticated synthetic fuel industry, once touted as liberation from dependence on imported petroleum, became a strategic liability. The complex plants required to produce synthetic fuel were vulnerable to bombing, used resources needed elsewhere, and could not match the quality or quantity of fuel flowing from American refineries that converted natural petroleum more efficiently. Master Sergeant Lipscomb received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his work developing the experimental fuel blend. The citation, heavily classified until 1948, credited him with initiative that significantly improved fighter performance during critical phase of the strategic bombing campaign. Lipscomb remained with the 56th Fighter Group through end of the war, eventually being promoted to warrant officer. Technical Sergeant Walsh, who had assisted with engine testing, received the Soldier's Medal for his role in the project. Both men survived the war and returned to civilian life. Lipscomb worked in petroleum industry in Oklahoma. Walsh operated an aircraft maintenance business in Ohio. Neither sought publicity for their contributions. The full story remained classified for years after war's end. The engineering lessons from this episode extended beyond immediate tactical applications. What Lipscomb had demonstrated was that existing aircraft possessed performance reserves that fuel chemistry constrained. This insight shaped American aviation fuel development through the remainder of the war. Petroleum engineers at refineries in Texas and California worked to develop progressively higher performance fuels, culminating in 150-grade fuel that entered service in mid-1944. Each improvement in fuel quality translated directly into aircraft performance without requiring modifications to airframes or engines. A P-47 Thunderbolt manufactured in 1942 could fly faster and climb higher in 1944 simply by using better fuel. This represented extraordinary return on investment. Developing new aircraft required years and billions of dollars. Improving fuel required months and millions of dollars while providing benefits across entire existing fleet. The psychological impact on both American and German pilots was significant. American pilots who had felt tactically constrained during early 1943 gained confidence as their aircraft's performance improved. Combat reports from late 1943 and early 1944 describe increasingly aggressive tactics as American pilots realized they could engage German fighters in any combat regime. German pilots experienced the inverse. They had relied on superior climbing performance as primary survival tactic. When this advantage disappeared, their tactical options narrowed dramatically. Many experienced German pilots were shot down during late 1943 while attempting escape maneuvers that had previously worked reliably. The psychological effect of having a proven survival technique suddenly fail cannot be overstated. Luftwaffe training doctrine had to change. Where German fighter tactics previously emphasized diving attacks followed by climbing escapes, new doctrine recommended hit-and-run attacks, using speed rather than altitude advantage. But changing tactical doctrine across hundreds of fighter squadrons while simultaneously replacing losses and training new pilots proved extremely difficult. By January 1944, the strategic air campaign over Germany had shifted decisively in America's favor. This resulted from multiple factors, including increasing numbers of long-range P-51 Mustangs, improvements in bomber defensive formations, and better fighter tactics. But fuel improvements that allowed existing P-47 Thunderbolts to match German climbing performance contributed significantly to this transformation. Statistical analysis of combat effectiveness tells the story through numbers. During July through September 1943, before widespread use of improved fuels, 8th Air Force fighters achieved an overall kill ratio of approximately 1.6 to 1 against German fighters. During October through December 1943, after transition to 130-grade fuel, the kill ratio improved to 2.8 to 1. These numbers represent thousands of individual combats aggregated into statistical patterns. The improvement cannot be attributed solely to fuel. American numerical superiority was increasing. Pilot experience was improving as surviving pilots accumulated combat hours. German pilot quality was declining as experienced aviators were killed and replaced by inadequately trained newcomers. But combat reports make clear that improved climbing performance played a significant role in these victories. Pilots consistently reported catching German fighters in vertical combat situations where such engagements had been impossible months earlier. The fuel that made this possible was not Lipscomb's experimental blend, but rather officially produced 130-grade fuel from American refineries. Yet Lipscomb's work had demonstrated feasibility months before official supplies arrived. During those critical months between August and November 1943, his unauthorized fuel provided tactical advantage that saved American lives. The question of how many lives Lipscomb's fuel saved cannot be answered precisely. No statistical analysis can isolate his contribution from the dozens of other factors affecting combat outcomes. But Colonel Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group through this period, offered his assessment in post-war interviews. Zemke estimated that improved fuel performance prevented at least 15 to 20 pilot losses during September and October of 1943, by allowing successful engagements in situations where aircraft would previously have been unable to pursue German fighters. 15 to 20 pilots might seem modest measured against the tens of thousands who served, but each pilot represented years of training, hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment, and irreplaceable combat experience. Each pilot who survived would fly additional missions, protect additional bombers, and contribute to eventual victory. The cascading effect of saving pilots early in the campaign amplified their value. German perspective on American fuel improvements came into focus after the war, when Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured Luftwaffe personnel. Major Gunther Rahl, who commanded fighter units on both eastern and western fronts, noted in post-war testimony that American fighter performance improved noticeably during late 1943. Rahl initially attributed this to new aircraft types or engine modifications. Only after examining captured American technical documents did German engineers realize fuel quality had changed. Rahl stated that this knowledge would have been valuable during the war, but would not have changed outcomes. Germany lacked industrial capacity to match American fuel production regardless of theoretical knowledge. General Adolf Galland, who commanded Luftwaffe fighter forces during the critical period, offered similar assessment. In his 1954 memoir, The First and the Last, Galland described American material superiority as overwhelming. German pilots faced enemies who possessed better fuel, more aircraft, superior training time, and logistical support that seemed unlimited. Galland concluded that by late 1943, Germany could not win the air war regardless of tactical innovations or pilot bravery. The technical details of 130-grade fuel merit examination because they reveal the petroleum chemistry that made performance improvements possible. The fuel's performance number of 130 on the rich mixture scale meant it could withstand 30% more compression than pure isooctane before detonating. This was achieved through careful blending of base gasoline with additives including tetraethyl lead, tryptane, and aromatic hydrocarbons. Tetraethyl lead was the primary anti-knock additive, working by interrupting the chemical chain reactions that led to spontaneous ignition. The compound was highly toxic, requiring special handling procedures by ground crews. Mechanics fueling aircraft wore protective gloves and avoided breathing vapors. Spills were treated as hazardous material incidents requiring immediate cleanup. Despite these hazards, tetraethyl lead was essential to producing high-performance aviation fuel. No other additive available during the 1940s could match its anti-knock effectiveness at reasonable cost. German fuel chemists understood tetraethyl lead's properties, but struggled to produce it in quantity. The manufacturing process required bromine, which Germany had to import or extract from seawater at great expense. American production of tetraethyl lead occurred at industrial scale. Ethyl Corporation operated plants in Louisiana and New Jersey, producing thousands of tons annually. This production capacity, like so many aspects of American industrial might, represented advantages that Germany simply could not match. The operational procedures for using 130-grade fuel required modest changes to pilot, training and maintenance practices. Pilots received briefings explaining that manifold pressure limits had increased from 52 inches to approximately 60 inches at war emergency power. They learned to monitor cylinder head temperatures more carefully because higher power settings generated more heat. They practiced fuel management techniques because running at maximum power consumed fuel rapidly. Maintenance crews adjusted inspection intervals and procedures. Spark plugs required more frequent replacement due to increased lead fouling. Cylinder head inspections became more regular. Oil analysis programs monitored for signs of increased engine wear. These changes added to maintenance workload, but were manageable within existing organizational structures. The remarkable aspect was how smoothly the transition occurred. Between October and December 1943, hundreds of fighters transitioned to new fuel with minimal disruption to operations. This reflected the quality of American technical documentation, the skill of maintenance personnel, and the robust design of R-2800 engines that could operate effectively with significantly improved fuel. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January 1944, virtually every American fighter squadron in England was operating on 130-grade fuel or better. The 56th Fighter Group, which had pioneered experimental blends, now flew on official fuel supplies indistinguishable from what every other group received. Lipscomb's contribution was complete. His unauthorized work had bridged the gap between identification of a problem and delivery of an official solution. The broader strategic context reveals why fuel improvements mattered so much during this specific period. The 8th Air Force was preparing for Big Week, the massive bombing campaign against German aircraft. Production facilities scheduled for late February 1944. Success required achieving air superiority over Germany so bombers could strike targets without prohibitive losses. Air superiority depended on fighter effectiveness, and fighter effectiveness was constrained by performance limitations that fuel improvements addressed. The ability of American fighters to match German climbing performance meant German fighter pilots could no longer use vertical escape maneuvers reliably. This forced them into horizontal combat, where American numerical superiority and 8-gun firepower advantages were decisive. During Big Week, which extended from February 20th to February 25th, 1944, American fighters achieved victory ratios exceeding 4-1 while protecting bomber formations that struck devastating blows against German aircraft production. German fighter losses totaled approximately 355 aircraft destroyed. These losses could not be replaced quickly enough. German aircraft factories could build new fighters, but experienced pilots killed during Big Week could not be replaced at all. The systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot cadre during late 1943 and early 1944 created a death spiral from which German fighter forces never recovered. Improved American fuel, by eliminating German climbing performance advantages, contributed directly to this outcome. The human stories behind these statistics deserve recognition. Every German fighter shot down during a failed climbing escape attempt represented a moment where American fuel chemistry proved decisive. Every American pilot who survived by catching a German fighter in vertical combat benefited from petroleum engineering developed far from any battlefield. These individual moments aggregated into strategic outcomes that shaped the war's final phase. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, whose aircraft received Lipscomb's experimental fuel on August 17, 1943, survived the war with 27 confirmed victories. Johnson became one of the 8th Air Force's leading aces, flying P-47 Thunderbolts exclusively. In post-war interviews, Johnson credited the P-47's ruggedness and firepower for his survival, but noted that aircraft performance improved noticeably during late 1943. Johnson did not learn about Lipscomb's experimental fuel until decades after the war, when researchers documenting the 56th Fighter Group's history uncovered classified reports. Johnson's reaction, documented in a 1983 interview, was surprise, followed by gratitude. He acknowledged that the August 17th mission, where he first caught a German fighter in a climbing attack, represented a turning point in his confidence and tactical approach. Other pilots who flew on Lipscomb's fuel during September 1943 had similar experiences. The combination of improved fuel and eventual arrival of paddle blade propellers transformed the P-47 from adequate to exceptional. By mid-1944, Thunderbolts equipped with both improvements could match or exceed German fighters in virtually every performance category except turning radius at low speeds. The industrial effort required to supply improved fuel at operational scale demonstrated American economic power operating at full capacity. Between October 1943 and May 1945, American refineries produced approximately 250 million gallons of 130 grade or better aviation fuel for European operations. This represented only a fraction of total American fuel production, which included gasoline for ground vehicles, diesel for ships and tanks, and various specialty fuels. Each gallon of high-octane aviation fuel required processing through multiple refining steps. Crude oil was first separated into fractions through distillation. The gasoline fraction underwent catalytic cracking to break long hydrocarbon chains into shorter molecules. Additional processing removed sulfur and other impurities. Blending added tetraethyl lead and other anti-knock compounds. Quality control testing verified octane ratings and performance numbers before fuel was certified for aviation use. This complex process occurred simultaneously at dozens of refineries. Coordination required sophisticated logistics planning, quality assurance protocols, and transportation infrastructure capable of moving millions of gallons monthly from refineries to ports, across Atlantic shipping lanes, through English distribution networks, and ultimately into aircraft fuel tanks at operational airfields. The contrast with German fuel production was stark. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, impressive as engineering achievements, operated at far smaller scale. Total German aviation fuel production for 1944 was approximately 400,000 tons, equivalent to roughly 130 million gallons. This was less than American production for European theatre alone, not including fuel supplied to Pacific operations, training commands, and allied nations. The disparity extended beyond quantity to quality. American refineries could adjust blending formulas relatively quickly to produce higher performance fuels as technology advanced. German synthetic fuel plants had less flexibility. The chemical processes that converted coal to liquid fuel imposed constraints that were difficult to modify without major reconstruction. This represented a fundamental strategic weakness that no amount of tactical brilliance or operational skill could overcome. German pilots flew aircraft with engines choked by inadequate fuel, while American pilots enjoyed chemical advantages that made their already capable aircraft even more effective. The post-war fate of key figures in this story reveals how quickly wartime innovations can be forgotten. Master Sergeant Lipscomb returned to Oklahoma in 1946 and resumed work in the petroleum industry. He never sought publicity for his wartime contributions. The Distinguished Flying Cross he received remained in a drawer, rarely mentioned even to family members. Lipscomb died in 1987. His obituary made no mention of the experimental fuel work that had influenced the air war over Europe. Technical Sergeant Walsh operated an aircraft maintenance business in Ohio through the 1970s. He occasionally spoke with aviation historians researching P-47 operations, but generally avoided discussing his wartime service. Walsh died in 1993. Few people outside aviation history circles knew of his contributions to testing unauthorized fuel blends. Colonel Hubert Zemke, whose decision to support Lipscomb's experiments rather than court-martial him proved crucial, commanded fighter units through the war's end. Zemke was shot down over Germany in November 1944 and spent the war's final months as a prisoner. After the war, he remained in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel. Zemke died in 1994. His memoirs briefly mentioned the fuel experiments, but did not emphasize their significance. The broader lesson from this episode concerns how military innovation actually occurs. Popular narratives emphasize dramatic breakthroughs and revolutionary technologies. The reality involves countless incremental improvements, many developed by junior personnel who see problems clearly because they work with equipment daily. Lipscomb's contribution was not revolutionary science. Petroleum chemists understood fuel blending principles. What Lipscomb provided was willingness to violate regulations he believed were killing pilots, and the practical skill to implement a solution quickly using available materials. This type of initiative, risky and technically unauthorized, characterized much of American military effectiveness during World War II. The organizational culture that rewarded Lipscomb rather than punishing him reflected American military pragmatism. Regulations existed to prevent dangerous improvisation, but commanders who achieved results through calculated rule-breaking were supported. This created tension between formal procedures and practical problem-solving that defined much of American military culture. German military culture, by contrast, emphasized strict adherence to technical procedures and formal approval processes. German mechanics who attempted unauthorized modifications faced severe punishment. This prevented dangerous experimentation, but also prevented the kind of rapid field innovation that characterized American operations. Neither approach was absolutely superior. American tolerance for improvisation sometimes led to disasters when poorly conceived modifications caused failures. German insistence on formal procedures prevented some problems while creating rigidity that slowed innovation. The key difference was that America's industrial capacity and resource advantages allowed absorbing costs of failed experiments while rapidly scaling successful innovations. The technical principles underlying high-octane fuel remain relevant to modern aviation despite the transition from piston engines to turbines. Jet engines burn fuel through continuous combustion rather than piston-driven compression cycles, but fuel chemistry still affects performance. Modern jet fuels must meet stringent specifications for energy content, thermal stability, and combustion characteristics. Military aircraft development continues to balance airframe design, engine capability, and fuel quality. Each component must be optimized in coordination with others. Improving one component without corresponding improvements in others provides limited benefits. This systems engineering approach, recognizing that overall performance depends on integrated optimization, was demonstrated clearly by the fuel improvements of 1943 and 1944. The historical irony is that fuel improvements, so crucial to Allied air superiority, received minimal recognition in popular accounts of the air war. Books and documentaries emphasize aircraft designs like the P-51 Mustang and dramatic missions like the raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Fuel chemistry, despite its fundamental importance, lacks the narrative appeal of dogfights and bombing runs. Yet the purple-dyed 150-grade fuel that powered Mustangs to speeds exceeding 440 mph, and the 130-grade fuel that allowed Thunderbolts to climb with German fighters, were as important to victory as any airframe design or tactical innovation. The petroleum engineers and refinery workers who produced these fuels never flew combat missions, but their work decided who controlled the skies over Europe. Master Sergeant Paul Lipscomb's unauthorized fuel experiments during August and September 1943 represented a brief chapter in this larger story. His contribution was ensuring that American pilots had access to improved fuel months before official channels could deliver it. Those months, spanning the critical period when the 8th Air Force was establishing air superiority over Germany, saw American fighter effectiveness improve significantly. The 15 to 20 pilots whose lives Zemke estimated Lipscomb's fuel had saved went on to fly hundreds of additional missions. Some became aces. Some trained new pilots. All contributed to the cumulative advantage that eventually made Allied air supremacy absolute. This cascading effect, impossible to measure precisely but undeniably real, represents Lipscomb's true legacy. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, American fighters dominated European skies so completely that Luftwaffe resistance had effectively ceased. This outcome resulted from overwhelming numerical superiority, superior pilot training, excellent aircraft designs, effective tactics, and the accumulated weight of industrial advantages expressed through thousands of details, including fuel chemistry. The story of how one mechanic's absurd fuel mixture helped P-47 seconds climb 4,000 feet higher than German fighters is ultimately a story about how wars are actually won, not through single wonder weapons or brilliant strategies, but through countless improvements, each addressing specific problems, each implemented by skilled personnel, each contributing to cumulative superiority. Lipscomb's willingness to violate regulations he believed were wrong, combined with Zemke's willingness to support unauthorized innovation, exemplified the pragmatic problem-solving culture that characterized American military effectiveness. The petroleum chemistry that made the fuel work exemplified American industrial and scientific advantages. The rapid transition from field experimentation to official production exemplified organizational flexibility. German forces faced enemies who could outproduce them, out-innovate them, and adapt faster than they could respond. The fuel that powered American fighters represented one manifestation of these advantages, expressed as chemical formulas, octane ratings, and manifold pressure limits that translated directly into tactical superiority. Every time a P-47 pilot pushed his throttle forward during late 1943 and felt his aircraft climb with power that had been impossible months earlier, he benefited from work done by a master sergeant in Oklahoma, who understood that sometimes the right solution requires ignoring the rules. Every German fighter pilot shot down while attempting vertical escape maneuvers that should have worked faced consequences of industrial disparities that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. The final accounting shows American fighters in Europe claiming approximately 12,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat between mid-1943 and May 1945. These victories resulted from many factors, but fuel improvements that eliminated German climbing performance advantages contributed measurably to this outcome during the critical period when air superiority was contested rather than assured. Master Sergeant Lipscomb's experimental fuel, crude by petroleum engineering standards but effective in combat, bridged the gap between problem identification and official solution. His contribution lasted only weeks before proper fuel supplies arrived, but those weeks came at a moment when the air war's outcome was uncertain and every advantage mattered. This is what made his work significant, not the chemistry, which petroleum engineers already understood, not the blending techniques, which were straightforward for anyone with proper knowledge, but the timing, coming at precisely the moment when American fighter pilots needed every possible advantage and the courage to act without authorization, because waiting for permission might cost lives. The purple liquid pumped into fuel tanks at Duxford during September 1943 represented accumulated industrial might, scientific knowledge, and individual initiative combining to create tactical advantage. That advantage, measured in manifold pressure readings and climb rates, in pilots saved and missions succeeded, helped determine who would win the war for Europe's skies. In that determination lay consequences far beyond aerial combat. Air superiority enabled the amphibious invasion that liberated Europe. Strategic bombing disrupted German war production. Fighter supremacy protected bombers that destroyed German oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation networks. Each of these outcomes depended on establishing control of the air, and control of the air depended partly on chemical engineering that allowed American fighters to perform beyond German expectations. The story concludes not with dramatic victories or celebrated heroes, but with quiet recognition that wars are won through accumulated advantages in thousands of details. Fuel chemistry was one such detail, invisible to those who focused on aircraft designs and pilot skills, but fundamental to the performance that made victory possible. Master Sergeant Lipscomb, working with borrowed equipment and improvised materials, contributed to this victory in ways that would remain classified for years and forgotten by most thereafter. Yet, his work mattered. The pilots who survived because their aircraft could climb with German fighters knew it mattered. The bombers that reached targets protected by fighters with adequate performance knew it mattered. The strategic outcome, achieved through cumulative advantages, including but not limited to fuel improvements, demonstrated it mattered. This is the lesson worth preserving. That victory belongs not just to those who fight, but to those who provide fighters with tools that work. That innovation comes from unexpected places, often from junior personnel closest to practical problems. That organizations which support initiative and tolerate calculated rule-breaking often outperform those which demand rigid adherence to procedures, and that wars are decided by accumulated weight of countless improvements, each small, each contributing to superiority that becomes overwhelming. The fuel that made P-47 seconds climb 4,000 feet higher than they should have was one such improvement. The mechanic who created it, violating regulations because following them cost lives, exemplified the problem-solving initiative that helped win the war. His story, like thousands of similar stories, deserves recognition not for drama, but for demonstrating how victory actually occurs in the complex reality of industrial warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. Don't forget to subscribe.